sometimes I make the coffee.
Honest. Okay, perfect.
Oh.
Okay, I'm going to open the doors.
Great stuff. So welcome to everyone who's coming in now. We have just opened up. We're going to just wait a couple of minutes while everybody gets a chance to come into the webinar, and then we'll be kicking off very shortly.
This is where you need the river dance music, Michelle.
I was going to sing a song, but I thought that might just empty the audience pretty quick. Should I try it? Maybe you could do a ukulele thing.
This
No.
COVID, it's made me very politically correct now.
Loads of people coming in. So we just give it one more minute and we will be ready to kick off.
Well, Michelle, when you see all those partner logos coming up, only 5 years ago, there was only 5 of them.
25, yeah.
Wow.
There'll be a couple more next year now, Gary.
Hopefully. Great names there. Should put Telly City up there, Maurice, for nostalgia purposes, maybe.
Then we could put techUK up as well.
Yeah, we could do an evolution, couldn't we?
Yeah.
Then
Well,
a picture of Harold's Cross back in the day.
no. The gas thing is the entity is still the same. So
Yeah.
the vehicle has never changed.
Yeah. Oh, right. Okay.
Yeah.
So on that, I think we'll kick off. We've got quite a few in our audience, so I think we're ready. We're ready to go. So welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Michelle Wallace, for anybody who doesn't know me. I've been working with Garry and Host in Ireland and our partners for the last 2 years, but a little bit longer in the industry. Today we're going to talk about data center myths and why they exist. You know, I suppose this is something that's baffled us really in one sense. In this pandemic, it's probably become clearer than ever. You know, the poster boy for pandemic version 1 was the Tiger King, and pandemic 2.0, who knows, it's probably the US election or Brexit or the fact that you can't get an Xbox or a PlayStation for love or money. And we don't do video conferencing anymore, right? We Zoom. Zoom has become a verb, and that's how things have changed so quickly this year. In the last 12 years or so that I've worked very closely in this industry, you know, I think it's only this year when it's getting really clear the why of why we do what we do and why it's so important in our daily lives. The data center industry itself is made up of 2 pieces: data, which is the Zoom, the Netflix. My dog wants to get involved here, apologies. The Zoom, the Netflix, the Facebook, local businesses getting themselves online. That's all going through data centers, because that's the second piece, is the center. And that is literally just holding and processing and enabling all of that data. Over the years, there's been a lot of mystery around data centers. I know that, you know, sometimes when I've told people that I'm in the data center industry, eyes glaze over, and you know, I kind of can send people asleep pretty quickly, to be honest, telling them what I do. And maybe it's because it's a bit boring, or maybe it hasn't been a priority for the industry to really explain. Maybe we've made it too complex. Maybe we talk about PUE a little bit too much. And you know, I'll be touching with Emma Fryer exactly on that point, and what we can do to change that. But the myths keep coming. And, you know, globally and locally, we decided last year that this was a great opportunity to delve deeper into the myths. And we created a blog with the help of Emma Fryer and our colleagues in the Dutch Data Center Association with Steengrove there. And it was the most popular piece of content on our website, on our social. Everybody just couldn't get enough of these myths, people from the industry, influencers, policymakers, journalists. So, you know, we know that there's a thirst for information around this. And so today, what we've decided to do, we're not just having this webinar here today, but we'll also be looking at, or we are also launching a podcast. And that is now online. It's live, it's available. There'll be a link here in the chat, which will bring you to it. We've spoken to 12 guests over the series. First two of the episodes of the series will be launched today. And so go along, have a look. It'll be on our website, it's on Spotify, it's on Google. And there'll be a lot more coming from that in the next few months as well. So to help us launch this momentous occasion and our fabulous podcast, which I'm sure you're all dying to just jump off here and listen to straight away, I have Emma Fryer, who's the Associate Director of techUK, Maurice Mortell, Managing Director of Ireland and Emerging Markets for Equinix, and of course our own Garry Connolly, founder of Host in Ireland and stubborn digital optimist. I was going to say something else. Stubborn digital optimist, to talk through why are we still talking about these myths? What are the myths, and what do we have to do about it? So with
Michelle, you know yourself, animals and children, you should never mix them in live broadcasting. So maybe it's best, and everybody appreciates, you want to put your dog out before he eats.
Well, I was going to do it very politely, Garry. I was actually going to now open up and let you guys introduce yourselves while I run off and let the dog out. Emma, would you please introduce yourself first and then pass the baton to Maurice to let Garry go last for being so rude.
I will. And actually, I sympathise with background noise, because although my husband bought me a cup of coffee, he's also very kindly turned on the bread machine in the kitchen below. So if you hear kind of grinds and whumping noises, it doesn't mean anyone's being murdered. It just means that there's a machine in action down there. So I'm Emma Fryer. I look after the UK data centre sector for techUK. techUK is a broad-based digital technology association. I tend to provide a collective voice for our operators in matters of policy, compliance and reputation. I think that probably sums me up. And yeah, we've been trying to myth bust for a long time, Garry and I. Anyway, I'll hand over to Maurice now.
Great, good afternoon. So Maurice Mortell, I'm Managing Director for Equinix in Ireland. Just to correct Michelle, I'm no longer looking after emerging markets. I've got 20 years, I suppose, experience in the industry in Ireland, probably since its beginnings back in the late 90s. And I've been through a number of iterations with our private company, Data Electronics, Telecity Group, and now Equinix. And more recently, I've taken on a kind of a wider EMEA role with Equinix, looking at our sustainability program, which is a very interesting topic and very topical at the moment. So great to be here.
Thanks, Maurice.
Garry, yeah.
Garry Connolly, founder of Host in Ireland. From academia, I was the world's worst COBOL programmer, which meant that I had to be very good with introductions, meeting people, connecting people. My whole desire really is to find great people that will work together for the right reason, on the right projects, and the right order. And I think that's what Host in Ireland is all about. I'm delighted to be here. As Emma and Maurice have said, we've been talking about myth busting for a long time. And it's just great now to have platforms like this where we can get to a great and wide audience to try and discuss it in more detail. So thank you, Michelle.
Thank you, Garry. Great. Well, just before we kick off and the questions and we dive in, just to let everybody know, because I think we've got a few more people coming in as we're chatting. We will be doing questions and answers at the end. So once I grill Emma, Maurice and Garry, we're going don't get nervous. We're going to have some questions and answers from the audience. So you have this opportunity to ask the questions live. If you're watching live on YouTube, you can still get a seat on the webinar if you want to ask Q&A. So, you know, just take that opportunity now. As you see questions coming up in the Q&A panel in Zoom, you can actually upvote so that we don't have a load of kind of the same questions. You can vote on questions that you really want to have answered. So just keep an eye on the Q&A box there, and we'll be addressing your questions in due course. So Emma, I'd love to kick off with you first, because I know that you have been dealing with myths quite a while. You're like the godmother of data center myths at this stage. You've produced amazing content, and I have always loved your content around, you know, how data centers really impact our lives, and, you know, what would happen if we switched off a data center and all that kind of stuff. Why do you think we're still having this conversation?
Yeah, there is no shortage of myths, that's for sure. And I've been doing this for about 10 years. I think I started in 2011 with data centers putting together collateral for our lobbying to get a climate change agreement. And at that point, I knew nothing about data centers. And therefore, I had to work out how to explain the sector to myself. And what I'd noticed with the dialogue to date is that all the operators talked in, you know, about adiabatic lapse rates and computational fluid dynamics and all this kind of stuff. And to the policymakers, they may as well have been talking Welsh. So I realized translation was necessary at that point. So I think there was a reason for the myths then, because no one had heard of anybody, and no one had done that bit of sort of translating. So we set about doing a whole bunch of documents that were then termed by the industry data centers for tiny tots. And they're not really, they're data centers for lay people. And there were things like, what is a data center, and data centers engine of growth, which, you know, Garry, I know, and I've shared that. You know, data centers a day in your life, so showing how as you go through a day. What have data centers ever done for us? Monty Python thrown in. And then we even represented the data center business models as a sherry trifle. So I really tried to take the technical stuff out of data centers. And that was all done in sort of 2013, 2014. So at that point, we thought, great, it's sorted. We've busted all the myths. But we hadn't. So I think there's a few reasons for why we're still constantly trying to address a range of myths in the sector. One of them, I think, does relate to policy. And obviously, I don't know whether that's true across Europe, but we have a rotation of individuals who are responsible for policy decisions. And I struggle with that, because the minute you get somebody sort of trained up, or you know, you get a knowledge base established within a particular department, you go back to them 6 months later and that person's moved on to, you know, DEFRA or something like that. And there's always been this policy that in government that, you know, good policy professionals, it doesn't really matter what they're doing, they can be polymath. I think that was true in the time of Samuel Pepys. You could do that then, but technology has moved on in the intervening 4 centuries. And I think we need more, you know, technical specialism within government. I don't think we're actually going to get that, so I think we're going to keep getting the myths. I think they're just going to come up. I think there's also, you know, massive policy disconnects, and I don't think that's true in Ireland so much, but certainly in the UK. I look at 4 really important policy initiatives. We had an industrial strategy. Data centers were not mentioned. And by not mentioned, I mean not mentioned, you know. Digital strategy, data centers were not mentioned. We had a National Infrastructure Commission, which was established without any digital infrastructure being included in its remit. And then we've got a national planning policy framework where data centers are not mentioned. So there are bound, you know, there is a total policy disconnect there, and there are, you know, there are bound to then, you know, it demonstrates a level of ignorance, I think, across, or certainly patchy awareness across the policy piece. So that's the policy bit. It's not all their fault. We must be doing something wrong. And I think there's a few characteristics of the sector. It's privately funded, so we've never had to go out for funding like HS2 or any big infrastructure project. You know, it's funded itself, so we don't have to go and ask government for staff. We certainly rather not. It's business facing generally up to until very recently. So a lot of the establishment of the sector has been very B2B. We like to be fairly obscure and secretive, because that helps us in terms of resilience. So I think that mixture of characteristics and the sort of policy, the way that policy is, you know, policy professionals are rotated within the sector, and the way that those people in power think about infrastructure, I think those things mean we're going to have myths around for a long time. And I haven't even gotten to the consumer bit, but I'm going to hand that back now.
And Emma, do you think that this year during this pandemic, and you know, when everything went online overnight, you know, digitization just, you know, increased exponentially in about 3 weeks.
Yep.
Do you think that that helped to align or at least kind of, you know, close that disconnect between policymakers and the general public and data centers?
Certainly with policymakers, because that's where I sit. I sort of sit between the sector and government to a great extent. With policymakers, there's been a seismic change in the UK. So, you know, we went into DCMS when we knew there was going to be a lockdown and said, you know, can we make sure that people working data centers are given key worker status? And they didn't just do that. They did that in 24 hours, which was incredible. They then gave us quarantine exemption, and they allowed data center construction projects to continue. Now, all construction projects in the end in the UK continued. I know that wasn't the same elsewhere, but if there had been a constraint on that, we would have been allowed to continue. And that was extraordinary. But with that sort of the recognition of the criticality, they then felt the need, and they do feel the need, to scrutinise our ability as a sector to continue to provide those resilient services. So you get the recognition, and then you get the scrutiny. So, you know, you can't have your cake and eat it. But definitely real game changer with government, certainly.
Thanks, Emma. And Garry, who cares? Why is it so important? Why do we even have to dispel these myths with data centers? What's so important about it?
Well, I guess the day that's in it, the 11th of the 11th, it's a good day to give thanks. And the year that's been in it, we've a lot not to give thanks for, but there's also a lot that we should reflect on and give thanks. And the front lines that we've had this year, Michelle, ranged from the healthcare front line, which is the number one front line that we looked to initially to give us assurances that things would be okay with regard to the pandemic. And also then of late, we've got the scientific front line who are working, collaborating to find the vaccine. But there's also the third ongoing front line, and that's the digital front line. And Emma has already mentioned about key workers, essential workers. And I guess that was just a monumental day for a lot of people in the data and the center industry, when right away across Europe, Ireland, the UK, data center people, operators were recognized early as essential workers. There was no sort of, in the UK, you mentioned 24 hours. We even had it before in Ireland, the lockdown was announced. That was significant because that meant that we were finally being recognized by policymakers as essential. They may not have known what we were essential for, but they knew that you were essential. So therefore, when we look at the digital front line, that's actually what has created and maintained for the last 8 months any form of normal. You know, there's all sorts of normals, from the current normal to the next normal. Let's just call it the hybrid normal that we're in at the moment. The digital frontline helped us with our work, for those of us who are able to continue to work, educated us and entertained us. From the time we got up in the morning, asking Alexa what the weather was going to be like, till the time at 2 a.m. we turned off Netflix. What have you been using for 18 hours a day in some capacity? A product called Alexa or Netflix or WhatsApp or Zoom. And all they are, for those that aren't clear, is a brand name for a data center. And to Emma's exact words, with an evolving industry, when you're very, very scientific people and very knowledgeable people, they use a language that only they understand. But really now what I have found, and Maurice will continue this discussion now in a moment, but we have to be identifying products that people use in their leisure, in their industry, to a data center. and I'll hand it over to Maurice in a moment, but I thought it was really significant, Emma, last week when David Attenborough joined Instagram for the first time. And effectively, the big headline was, David Attenborough joins Instagram to help save the planet. Actually, what that was, Instagram is just a brand name for a data center. So you could replace it and say, David Attenborough joins a data center to save the planet. But that's what so the myth that I'm trying to get across that should be dispelled now, Michelle, is that what and why should I as a citizen care about a data center? That should be dispelled now. And how we as an industry, or people like me who work on the industry, can be far better equipped to do that is to put brand names and product names rather than just a center and PUE and stuff. So I think I'd hand it back to you, but that's the one myth I think that we must start to move, because even policymakers are citizens. They even use these products.
Yeah, indeed. We're all consumers. And Maurice, this is a good segue into you, and just from, because one of those myths that Emma discussed was, data centers are nothing to do with me, and how that's changed over the last, 8-9 months now. From your perspective, how is the world changing in terms of its consumption of data and how we're using it?
Sure. So let's just think, if we were having this pandemic 10 years ago, what would we be doing, and how would we be communicating with each other, and how would we be working remotely or not, as the case may be. So I think what has happened over the last decade is that, communications, infrastructure, applications, individuals and companies' consumption of services and infrastructure has changed, but everything has caught up with each other. So we've got a perfect example where during the pandemic we were able to easily move into this situation where applications, bandwidth capabilities, data centers, digital infrastructure were all capable of handling this transition. So we just have to note the fact that we could not have done this a number of years ago. And then the other best way probably to answer that is, we've been doing this. It's a global interconnection index. We've been doing it for 4 years now. We bring it out every year. We just brought out the 4th version of it, and that's showing a growth in data. And this is private data that's exchanged between companies and partners within the data centers over these interconnection platforms. It's growing by 45% per annum. Now that's just showing you the trend and the shift of what enterprises and companies are doing with regards to their own data and their own, I suppose, journey into the cloud or digital transformation or digitization. And without the digital infrastructure that we and our colleagues provide, it's not possible to do that. You don't have the ability to get onto the cloud service providers. You don't have the ability to get onto the networks. You don't have the ability to access the ecosystem. So we've mentioned all the applications that people have been using. Online gaming is another huge one that people have been using. We've seen huge jumps in bandwidth usage. You continue to see that. Remote working will now become a working philosophy of the future. I don't think any company is going to go back to the way that it was, and we're going to be looking at how we support our staff in a very different way. So that goes for schools, it goes for the health industry, it goes for online consulting for GPs, it goes for sending X-rays off. Everything that we've been able to do from our homes has been enabled by digital infrastructure in data centers, and I think that's not going to change. And I think Emma's dead right. There's been a large body of work done to educate the policymakers around what it is our industry does and what it delivers. And there's loads of different parts of the economy that hits on. But if you think of just the basics of being able to do stuff like this, and without that infrastructure in place, that would have been almost impossible to do.
Indeed. Thanks, Maurice. And that brings us on, I suppose, when you're talking about remote working and people working from home, what about data centers? What about the people employed in data centers? This is another, area of discussion or concern that we've been looking at. I know in August we surveyed 50 companies and we identified 1,800 jobs in the next 12 months in Ireland coming up in this industry. And that was actually just a small cross section of the market, and very specifically in the industry itself, not also including the kind of layers that sit above that. Can you help me understand this? Why are we, where are all these jobs coming from if they're not in the centers themselves? Do you want to take that, Garry?
Yeah, so I think what's important again is the language that we use. Data centers haven't just materialized over the last 12 months. Data centers are just a current manifestation of how we store, forward, and manipulate data. It's evolved over 60 odd years. But for the purpose of explaining to you the job aspect, Michelle, I think it's important even to go back 20 years. And let's use Ireland as an example. 20 years ago, in 2000, Ireland was recognized as the largest exporter of software in the world, bar none. Okay? We used to do a thing called localization, where we take all the software from all over the world, turn it into German, Italian, French, etc. And we would do localization and we will punch them onto floppy disks and CD-ROMs. Very tangible. I'll use another example, Microsoft in Sandyford. They used to have a warehouse and they used to have a localization center, both together. And in the warehouse, it was full of floppy disks and CD-ROMs, the end point in the process. But they were joined together and there were 3,500 people working in that office beside it, localizing, okay? Everybody was, wow, what a great industry. Isn't that wonderful? Ireland's the largest exporter of software in the world. Look at all those jobs out in Sandyford with Microsoft. How many people were working in the warehouse? 15, 20 people. Storing, stacking, distributing the product. Forgotten about because it was together, 2,500 people. The natural cycle of the evolution of the taking away from physical media, so the floppy disk is gone, the CD-ROM is gone. The warehouse now is the data center. The 4,500 jobs are somewhere else, but you cannot disconnect the data from the center and the center from the data. So what people look at the moment is they look, oh, short-term construction jobs. Well, I question that as well, because most of the data centers that are being built, and Maurice will tell you this firsthand, they're like San Francisco Bridge. You only finish the data center and you have to start again and refresh it. That's the first thing. The jobs that are actually being created to maintain, they're significant, but the data is where the jobs, and working on the data as distinct to the center. And you can't disconnect the two. And then, of course, you've got the economic and job multipliers. Again, to Emma's point, North Virginia Technology Council, Emma and the techUK, the Dutch Data Center Association, we've all done the external secondary and tertiary jobs associated with the center. And it's quite significant. So jobs is a funny one because people prefer to go back to things that they can understand, like a floppy disk and a CD-ROM and punching down machines. We've changed. We haven't communicated. The industry hasn't communicated really as well as it might. That really all of that we're at now, the cloud or data centers, whatever, is just an evolution of floppy disks. It's the same, and the jobs have to be in their entirety. So I think that it's just evolving, and words do matter. I know I've heard that a lot in political circles over the last few weeks. Words do matter. And when you look at, to Emma's point, a lot of people and policymakers will often say, these data centers, not too sure about them, because they'll all go away when the cloud takes over. Again, words matter. They're one and the same. And that's why the job thing is harder for people to understand, but they're there. And in fact, they're growing at a significant rate.
Maybe, Michelle, just another comment on top of that. I mean, I feel that the direct employment, issue we've talked about for ages, and we know there's a huge pyramid impact on data centers, with regards to the long tail of employment that's attached to them. But we also have to discuss the economic benefit of having, that sort of digital infrastructure in our country, and how that attracts inward investment into Ireland as its location in Europe. And just recently there, Ireland, has taken over Paris as, the fourth largest digital infrastructure hub in Europe on capacity. And I mean, these are massive cornerstones to how we build our digital economy of the future. And, so the knock on, we can multiply out the multiplier on the jobs. I think the IDA there said recently in a report that there was 20,000 jobs created in 2019, that are working on the digital infrastructure industry. There's huge exporting of jobs and skills and capability around this industry through Enterprise Ireland, because the skills that have been developed in Ireland over the last 15, 20 years in this industry are now being exported out, and they all generate huge income for those companies, and they generate huge income for our exchequer. So, I think, to me, that has to be taken off the table now. It's an absolute requirement. We need to understand what the future of our economy and the digitization of Europe and Ireland needs. These cornerstones, sort of pillars of infrastructure to build on for future growth.
That's a really great point that Maurice makes with regard to the value and the economic value of the data. What I was referencing a moment ago was the OECD report in 2000. At $3.2 billion, I think, Ireland, the largest exporter of software in the world. The current CSO, for instance, of this year for data and ICT related services exports from Ireland is $122 billion for ICT and related services of exports, which is the data in the centers. It is because of that, and along with pharmaceuticals and along with healthcare and biocare, that Ireland this year so far is showing an export GDP of flat, the only one in the European Union, because of our digital exports. But again, I go back to, if we had 40-foot containers packed with CD-ROMs and floppy disks coming out of Microsoft or Oracle or all the guys, people will be clapping them as they go onto the 40-foot containers onto the ships. They're going off via fiber optic cables. But it's 26% of our exports is ICT and related services. That's the software or the data that sits in the centers, which then reinforced all the jobs of the people who work on the data, which are all the big multinationals and the SMEs and the infrastructure that supports that.
Garry, I think the core thing is that we don't position the sector correctly, and it certainly isn't perceived correctly as infrastructure. And when you talk about, people think of data centers being fancy warehouses, and that's how they're actually classed at the moment in planning at the moment in the UK. So there's a kind of it's a misclassification, because if you were building a new road, you wouldn't ask how many people that road was going to employ as a road. What you want to know is how many journeys it's going to shorten, how much better connectivity it's going to provide between centres of commerce and centres of population. Yeah. So, and the fact that we don't value stuff as infrastructure when it's digital is bizarre to me, because actually digital infrastructure has been demonstrated to be a much faster driver of growth than anything else. And I hope I'm not repeating it, because I fell off the call for a minute because I had to switch my Wi-Fi's over when one fell over. Well, that's resilience for you. But anyway, it's an infrastructure play.
Those data centers, they're always inefficient.
And I think that's a really good point, because there's one thing there that I wanted to cover, but you've actually covered it. And there is this question around, you know, Ireland and the greater Dublin metro area in particular has the largest cluster of data centers in Europe. And so why, you know, to your point, Emma, why would we do that? You know, we don't have, you know, motorways going down every inch of the, you know, of our country from an infrastructure perspective. But I think to Gary's point, it's what that enables. It's that these are the factories that enable that export number. And also provide the infrastructure for these ICT companies to exist in Ireland.
They're just factories, Michelle, the same as any other form of foreign direct investment into Ireland. Think of Pfizer in Cork. 99% of the tablets they manufacture are exported. 99% of the data that's resting in Ireland in data centers is for export, same way as the floppy disks back in the day. It's just another form of foreign direct investment.
Yeah.
Very important one.
I have a question here, and it kind of touches on, I'm looking at the questions coming in. We're not quite at the Q&A session yet, but I'm trying to keep an eye on them so we can answer some of them maybe through our questions. But there's this piece around digitization, and, you know, surely the more we digitize, the more energy we're using. And this is kind of I suppose, something that comes up again and again. What are we seeing in terms of, you know, our electricity use and our power use versus the data that's being processed now? And I'm going to throw that out to either Emma or Gary. Who wants it?
Do you want me to start, Gary?
Yeah.
Or do you want to start?
No, start. I might stop. You go ahead.
So in terms of digitization, so digitization has a capability to massively reduce energy, and actually there's a really good report out by the International Energy Agency on the scope for energy savings, global energy savings through digitization. So digitization has that potential. So that's something that we need to capture. But in order to achieve those savings, we have to use it intelligently. So it's about the intelligent use of ICT. On the other hand, we have the problem that the kind of services we use are very price elastic. And a price elastic commodity is something you use more of when it gets cheaper. So that's the opposite. So a coffin. Coffin is not price elastic, because if it got more expensive, I wouldn't buy. You know, I'm going to need one coffin. I'm still going to buy one coffin or have need of it. And if it gets cheaper, I'm not going to stockpile a load of coffins because I'm only going to need one. So a coffin is a price inelastic commodity. And but comms are incredibly price elastic. So the more we do and the cheaper it is, so the cheaper it is, the more we do. And so what we've got to watch is profligacy, digital profligacy on services. So in terms of how we use those. So it's often characterized as Jevons or Jevons paradox, where the cheaper something gets, you then use much more of it than you would have done if it had been expensive, remained expensive. So that is the problem we have. And we also have a problem with transparency in the industry, that there's, in some of the sort of advertorial, particularly consumer-facing advertorial and freemium models, there's no signal being given of the energy impact of those online activities. So that's another thing that we have to bear in mind. And I think we will have to work as a sector. And we are actually making some quite good progress in terms of improving transparency. So you've got those two big arguments, and people tend to plump down on one or the other, but both those things are very material to this discussion.
I think also what we have, Michelle, is that, again, going back to people who work in the industry know that the data centers that we know now, the commercial centralized data centers, are actually just the current manifestation of data centers that were there 20 years ago. And the IEA, that report that Emma is referencing, have actually demonstrated that over the last 10 years, that the energy, raw energy going into data centers is the same 10 years ago as now, 1%. You say, how could that be? Well, actually, what's happened is that all of the tens of hundreds of thousands of small, isolated, on-premise centers or comms rooms are now starting to be retired. They're like inefficient 300 kilowatts, etc., and centralized. That's the first thing. But the second and most important thing that gets missed, in my opinion, is that policymakers, detractors for change, talk about the silver bullets called smart devices, smart cars, smart grids, smart cities. All you're saying is that's data. The smart inside any device is given by the data. The data sits in a center. So when we look at, I just got today, or last week, should I say, a notification that I'm getting a smart meter in my house here in Enniskerry. And one of the things that EirGrid is putting smart meters in for is to decarbonize the grid. And they reckon that it'll be 17% just with these, because we'll become prosumers. I can sell energy and things. The smart in that meter is actually data that resides in a center. So it's the net figure that we're all working towards, the net figure that needs to be negative or neutral by 2030. So the data that sits in the center by far is a multiple of the savings of the energy that's been used. Maurice and I, we can talk now about Ireland. And I guess it's important because, like foreign direct investment for Ireland and data and foreign direct investment in Ireland has been a huge part of 60 years of our economy, our exporting of our economy. When we look at the centers, and we mentioned earlier, it's 26% of our service exports, we then have to say, well, what's the market going forward? And the market going forward is for green data. That's the market. Let's be under no illusion that the stakeholders of the companies, the end users of the companies, and the purchasers of these companies, and most importantly, the money that's investing into them, is expecting that the data will be green. So we're in a hybrid right now. We can't produce enough green to feed into the data to export it. But the companies that are driving this change and driving these centers are also the largest procurers of renewable energy globally, bar none. So that's where we're at. We're actually in a position where we're recognized as one of the largest exporters right now. We have, and Maurice can talk to this, we have capacity, 15 times more capacity in Ireland to generate renewable energy than we can ever consume. Imagine that, 15 times more than we can ever consume. It's a natural resource. So what are we going to do with it? This is the question. And that's where you start, then you ask questions about some of the headlines, like 28, 29, 39, 41% of electricity in Ireland will be used for data centers. That's only because we're not generating enough, actually, in many respects. So you can turn the discussion around. And Maurice, when in his new role in Equinix, it's all about ESG, right? That's what you're all about now.
Absolutely. I mean, if we just take Ireland, you know, and look at the growth in, and I say this in general terms, in the industry, it's been significant. There's no doubt about that. But you know, location of data centers, this data center location impacts data center success. So it kind of feeds itself. And we've been very lucky in Ireland that we've attracted so much investment, critical infrastructure, digital infrastructure, that's why it's there. I mean, and we've had 15 years of this. You know, Ireland has all the the DP laws, we've got this, ease of doing business. We've got a whole lot of things that our government has set up to enable these investments take place. I think what's driving a lot of the questions coming in there is around, okay, this growth now, how are we going to manage this growth in a sustainable and renewable way? I think that's the question that's been asked, and sort of there's no easy answer to that because it's a challenge, but it's a challenge for the whole industry. It's not just the data center industry. I mean, technology growth, technology related growth is global. It's happening everywhere. It's not just happening in Ireland. It's happening in every single country, and they're all dealing with the same challenges. So, our journey, Equinix as a company has committed to be 100% clean tech and renewable across its global footprint. Okay, we know that global footprint is significant, and it's going to take us time to get there. But I think the reality, the point to make is that we're acutely aware of our responsibility to the environments that we work in. We're acutely aware to the stakeholders that we represent, which are our shareholders, our customers, our employees, and the communities that we work in. And we understand, what's needed to balance that out. And when we look at legacy infrastructure, we look at new infrastructure, and we look at the type of data center of the future, and we look at our targets in Ireland for carbon neutrality. Those targets of 70-30 were factored in for all the growth of the data center industry. I mean, these aren't going to change that. They're there, and it's our industry will form part of the solution for the renewable energy requirements into Ireland. And bear in mind that Ireland is huge, as Garry mentioned. We've got such a great asset around our island for renewable energy, whether it's offshore, wind, or solar. We've a whole load of stuff that we can bring to the table around renewable energy. And I think, our whole industry, it's incumbent. And by the way, fixing this is our industry, it's policymakers, it's the supply chain into our industry. It's not just Equinix or anybody else. It's a combination of people looking at this holistically. And if you take the other role that I have, and you look at what's happening across Europe, the European Union are looking at their digitalization and their program for what part. I'm sorry, they know the critical part of the data centers are going to play in the digitalization of Europe. If you look at smart cities, and you look at autonomous vehicles, and you look at AI, you look at all digital edge, you look at all the stuff that they're trying to do to bring Europe forward, and they know our industry will play a huge part in ensuring that happens. But they want it in a renewable way. So they've already set targets for our industry to be carbon neutral by 2030, and for the whole region to be zero carbon by neutral by 2050. So that program has to start now. And we work with the EU DCA, and we work with the policy committee, and we work with educating the policymakers in Europe to understand what we're doing to try to achieve that, and what they have to do to support that. And so I think the industry is acutely aware of its responsibilities, and aware of the impacts that it has, and the climate action plans, and all the issues that each country is facing around what they need to do to get to where they need to get to. So, I've a fairly large stakeholder now in this process for us in Europe, and I don't think the industry is going to be found wanting at all. On the contrary, it's going to be a huge supporter and investor in how we get to where we need to get to.
Okay, great. Thanks, Maurice. Now, I'm just at this point, because time has flown, and it's 10 to 1 already. We've got a lot of questions in here, and just to let everybody know, we're not going to be able to deal with all of these questions for sure. We're going to get through a few of them now. We may actually look at them, and if we've got enough there, we might even do a little video afterwards and put out the answers, or do a blog or something. We'll have a look at them anyway. So thanks for everybody for putting in the questions. a lot of the questions also are being dealt with in the podcast itself, because we only have an hour right now, and the podcast is over 5 hours of content. So the link is in there in the chat. So if you do want to kind of go there, you'll get you will get some of the answers in there. Now, the first questions, because we've got this opportunity to upvote on the questions, it's great because people can kind of say the questions they want answered. And the first question there, a lot of it I think we've touched on, but I think there's a couple of bits specifically that we can probably answer here today. So from Alan Cooney, by 2028 data centers, and it has just come out, there we go. So by 2028, data centres and other large users will consume 29% of Ireland's electricity, according to EirGrid, Ireland's transmission system operator. Worldwide data centres consume about 2% of electricity, a figure set to reach 8% by 2030. Few countries, if any, will match Ireland's level. Ireland is one of the EU's worst carbon emission offenders and faces fines of more than 250 million for missing 2020 targets on reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Missing later targets will trigger steeper fines. From a carbon footprint point of view, has Ireland reached its saturation point for data centres?
There's two very quick points to be made there. The first one is that data centers are part of the foreign direct investment offering, in the same way as I mentioned earlier about Pfizer and financial services down the IFSC. So we will always have a disproportionate amount of activity. The same can be said about our exports for pharmaceuticals. Is nuts. 50,000 Viagra tablets a week or something is being shipped out of Pfizer. So data in the centers. The second thing is we really need to start looking at that overall carbon figure and the carbon laggard. When we look at the challenges that Ireland Inc. has regarding carbon as an overhead, it's broken into 4 parts: energy, agriculture, transport, and home heating. And actually, if the guys on the Irish Wind Energy or EirGrid or Irish Solar are here, the one that's actually winning, if it is the word to use, the one that's actually going in the right direction is the decarbonisation of our electrical system. No fines are being paid, nor will they be paid for 2020 associated with our electrical generation. Very important to note. If we look at, and our friends in BitPower do research with us every single quarter, biannual now, that data centers currently are responsible for 1.56% of Ireland's carbon. At its peak in mid this decade, it'll be at 2.22% of Ireland's carbon, of a reduced carbon number. Talking about 28%, to Maurice's point, we will be generating, we have the capacity in and around and on, and even with hydrogen and other forms, we have the potential to generate 15 times more renewable energy than Ireland can ever consume. So the question is, are we going to actually grab that natural resource and export it, do nothing with it, export it on wholesale, or take it as a raw material to create a product and service called data and export it with all the economic benefits? We need to slightly turn the question, but we need to be clear about Ireland's targets and all the rest. If you look at that, electricity is one of the better news stories of that 4-pillar carbon story.
Okay, great. Thank you, Garry. Quick question for you, Maurice. What does the role of direct air capture and negative carbon emissions technology have in the development of clean green data centers? Is that something that, forms part of your remit at the moment? Is it part of the solution? Is it something that you're looking at? Or is there other areas that you're focusing on right now?
Well, yeah, I mean, so the way we've looked at this is there's the design and construction of the data center of the future. So that's going to be the most efficient, green, carbon neutral we can make it. And then there's our legacy infrastructure. So there's our existing sites that we have, which is most of the sites we have across Europe. And how do you make them more efficient? And how do we, reduce the energy usage, reduce the carbon footprint, and look at our cooling, look at our, water treatment, look at our green rooftops, look at heat capture projects, We mentioned, hydrogen fuel cells, on-site storage, so anything that's gonna, make those sites more efficient is one sort of roadmap and target. And then there's what do we do with our new sites? And I think I know a lot of our new projects are taking into account how we look at our, our backup generation, how we look at our how they get built and designed in general terms. And that's, and I said it earlier on, that's working with our stakeholders as well. That's working with the communities that we build the sites in. It's working with our customers. It's working with our shareholders. It's working with a whole bunch of our supply chain to understand how can we do this in a more climate effective way.
Electricity is expensive as well, Maurice. I guess the less you use, the more you save.
Absolutely, yeah. But when you automatically reduce your footprint by being more efficient anyway. And we've said it earlier on that the most inefficient infrastructure is the stuff that's still out there that isn't sitting in a data center. I mean, it's it's 10 to 1. It's 10 times more efficient sitting in a facility than it is sitting in.
It's often said in many circles that the greenest electron is the electron that's not used.
Can I ask actually Emma to pop in here, because I know Emma has this amazing example about how technology. I'll get you to explain. You know what I'm talking about, right?
Is this the improvement? I was going to just second what was said about moving stuff out of on-premise distributed IT. It's massive savings in doing that, and that's where the trend is through divestment. I have typed that into the answer, and I'm sorry. I think that's why I crashed all the questions. I'm sorry about that. It's my fault.
That's okay.
So the one we were looking at, which I did put in for a joke, and John Summers, credit to John Summers, he said actually you can't really do that with airlines, but anyway, because they're quite efficient. But we looked at over the last 3 decades roughly the amount of energy it takes to process a given amount of data has been reduced by 7 orders of magnitude. So you actually need a logarithmic chart to show that. So essentially that's it takes 10 million times less energy to process a given amount of data than it did in about 1999.
Wow.
That's quite significant. Then if you applied that to, say, flying to New York, I looked up how many litres it takes to fly to New York, and you'd be able to fly to New York and back for 16 millilitres of fuel, which is about the same as 3 teaspoons of Calpol. And actually, obviously the question there is, then I guess we might fly more, So you can see why these things are linked. But that was and I just thought it was a fun example, and I'm sure I'll be shut down. But
and I also never knew Calpol was so powerful. That's phenomenal. There's a whole new myth out there now.
but it still does put your children to sleep on the flight. That's the main thing.
It's a universal measure, isn't it? Everyone knows what a teaspoon of Calpol is, don't they?
They do. Thank you. Will we try and squeeze in one more question? One really quick one. We're literally at the hour. What I am going to do, actually, before we answer this last question, there's so many questions, and I'm sorry we haven't got to all of them. There's still, I think, 26 or so questions left.
We did the last time.
We'll have a look at them afterwards. Yeah, absolutely. But what I do want to say before we do, we will get to one more question. The podcast link is in the chat there, so have a look at that for anybody who does want to go into a bit more detail. Garry interviewed 12 guests along the way, and over the next 5 weeks we'll be issuing those.
It's called Bits, Bytes and Banter, so it's not all tech. There's good people and good chats about sport and all sorts of stuff, so it won't be all about PUE.
It's not. No, it definitely isn't. And then the other thing is that our next webinar is going to be on the 3rd of December. And that is changing the way we live, work and play, global data in 2020. So there's a registration link there in the chat as well, if anybody wants to join us on that. Now, really, really quick, because I know we're at the top of the hour. Future growth in the construction, Barry's question, future growth in the construction of data centers. How long will this last? Will it contract as the edge and innovation takes over? And if so, is that 5-10 years? And question 2, is the UK to expect huge growth for 2021? Okay, that's another question altogether. So future growth of the construction of data centers, how long will it last? Is it going to start contracting?
Maurice, do you want to give it a shout out? Do you want?
Well, I guess I suppose I'll give you the view that I'm seeing. I mean, no, not at the moment. I think we're at the phase, another upward phase of growth around development, and we see that in Ireland in particular, and I see that across all our European footprint and global. I suppose ultimately, how much infrastructure is needed to support the data. If the data keeps growing as it is currently, then we're going to require to continue to have facilities. There's an element there of digital edge, which I came into the question, which I suppose does ask the question, do we have smaller capture components for data, more eyeballs closer to the devices to get access to information to analyze it. But our data, I think ultimately that's going to possibly change some of the dynamics, but it still has to go back to somewhere else to be to compute and then interconnect wherever that is. So I think for now I see a continued development in growth of required infrastructure to support the growth of the data.
There's probably three quick aspects of that as well to support what Maurice is saying. IDC recently said that there's 4% of the data that we have now. Sorry, there's 4% in the world now that we'll have in 2030. We've 25 billion things, IoT, intelligent things now. We'll have 1 trillion at the end of this decade. That's the anticipated. The other thing to remember is that there's only 4.5 billion of the global population that are connected currently out of 7 billion. And the third thing, and Maurice has been in the industry long enough to know that the refresh cycles to drive new efficiencies and to drive new products and reduce energy and all these things is accelerating. So data centers used to wait maybe 10 years, Maurice, maybe more, before you did a refresh. Now it can be up to 5 years because new technologies are coming in. We thought free air cooling was going to be the thing, but now we've got quantum computing. So we need, immersive cooling and stuff. So there's all these new technologies coming in. And as to the point that Maurice just finally made, if you think of the overall data center, edge, regional, metropolitan, think of a Russian doll. One goes inside the other, goes inside the other, goes inside the other, goes inside the other, like a Russian doll. So the data that's being collected in the tiny little thing at the edge, I love the industry that Maurice is in. They've called it now mist computing. We thought we just got over cloud. Now it's called mist computing or fog computing, but they all contract. So you're looking at least, I don't know, 2 decades before you even refresh again, and then it'll happen again.
Okay, great. Well, listen, we're a bit over time, so we're going to end it there. Thank you so much, Garry, Maurice, and Emma. Really appreciate you coming on with us today. It's always an absolute pleasure to talk to you. I really enjoyed the conversation, and hopefully everybody else did as well. So thank you. As I said, we will get to those questions. There are even more. There's more piling up there. There's now 37 odd questions. So we will have a look at those, and we'll see if there's something that we can put together and maybe get some of those answered. But meanwhile, have a look at our next webinar on the 3rd of December. We've got our podcast launching also, actually, which will help a lot of people, and some of the questions actually in there as well. Our quarterly report or our biannual report is going to be made available on Monday. So anybody on our mailing list, anybody on this call will get that into their inbox. So keep an eye out for that as well. That'll be coming out into the inbox on Monday. There's loads going on. So thanks, everybody. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
Thanks a million. It's like the Eurovision. Waiting for the results to come in.
We're waiting to switch it off.
Mortell didn't waste any time. He's gone for his lunch.
Some really interesting questions, actually. I think the questions would make a really good basis for an FAQ.
Yeah.
Because they're coming from actually people who know the industry.
Yeah.
And that should tell us what we're not getting right, what we're not getting right in terms of the answers. So, yeah, if you're capturing the questions, I think that would be a really good, it would give us a good steer on what we need to address.
I remember being asked to go over when Simon that's now with the Infrastructure Masons, Simon?
Alan.
And he asked me to go over and give a quick talk to the people. I think he was in DCA at the time, or one of the associations.
Right. Now, hang on, guys. I'm just going to. I think we're just going to close this this up here, and what we'll do is we will meet again shortly. That's okay.
All right. Thanks a million.
Is that all right? Okay.
Thanks.
Bye.
Take care. Bye now.
Thanks, Emma. See you later.
Yeah. See you. Bye.
Always good to see you. You're a champion.